welcome to the Frontline. I think you will enjoy today's show. It's on taxes and tax policy. Don't run away yet. We are going to be discussing Sir Roger Douglas's latest proposal on taxes. We're going to talk a little bit about Rogernomics, the privatization and deregulation that New Zealand went through in the 80s to significant negative effect in terms of increasing wealth inequality and increasing poverty. And we're going to talk about how that contrasts with his proposal this time to decrease corporate welfare, decrease landlord subsidies, eliminate taxes on people earning less than $60,000 a year. But it comes at a cost of increased retirement age, increased GST, increased superannuation, mandatory savings accounts for low-income workers, and some evidence that it would increase poverty and wealth inequality in New Zealand, all in hopes of, quote unquote, preserving superannuation for the future. So we're living through interesting times now where people that I thought were out of the mainstream or perhaps even passed away are being resurrected and put back into the mainstream. We've got Ruth Richardson and now Sir Roger Douglas. And so in today's interview, we're going to drill down on these issues, speaking with Terry Baucher. He's a tax consultant, an author, a commentator, has his own podcast on taxes. I think it's called the New Zealand Tax Podcast. And we spend a good long time dealing with issues of wealth inequality and taxation in New Zealand, talking about what is right and what is fair. And some ideas for the future. So I hope you'll enjoy this next 50 minutes. And if you would like to see more of this sort of thing, just comment. And remember to subscribe to this podcast if you want to get things like this delivered to your inbox regularly. Thanks for joining us. Let's get on with the show. All right. Hello, Terry, and thank you for joining me on the front line to talk about regressive taxes and Sir Roger Douglas's proposal. Can you, Terry Baucher, introduce yourself to the audience? You're an accountant. You're also a prolific writer. You've got a podcast. You kind of do it all. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Kia ora, Gary. I'm kia ora kutu katoa. Haere mai. I'm Terry Baucher, and actually I'm not quite an accountant. I'm fall between several stools. I'm primarily a tax consultant, but somehow I've evolved into something of a media commentator. I have run a podcast called the New Zealand Tax Podcast. As far as I'm aware, it's still the only one, which goes out weekly. And but my background is I'm a tax consultant specialist, dealing with all sorts of issues, helping accountants as well as ordinary people deal with the myriad of things that happen. In terms of a career, I won't go into too much, but I wrote a book with, she's now the Honourable Dr. Deborah Russell, MP. We wrote a small book called Tax and Fairness in 2017, looking at the tax system. And subsequently to that, I was lucky enough to be part of the Small Business Council, which was around between 2018 and 2019. So I have a number of fingers in a lot of pie, but when my day job is as a tax consultant, but I enjoy talking about tax very frequently. So be warned.
Well,
yes,
the tax issues we can talk about today revolve around this really interesting idea from Sir Roger Douglas that is different than what I've been hearing. It's got a little bit of regressive tax features, a little bit of progressive tax features. It sort of makes everyone happy and no one happy. So I thought it'd be fascinating to talk through it. Do you have a minute to do that with us?
Certainly, I do. And the genesis of this, to be fair, so the immediate genesis of why this popped up on both our radars, Gary, is that Inland Revenue, as part of all government agencies, have to release what they call long-term insights briefings. And these are basically what that agency thinks is a long-term issue that is potentially the government and the country needs to be public need to be briefed about, and issue and how we might respond to it. And what Inland Revenue did, they have to be done every 3 years. And what Inland Revenue did in this one is said, well, we want to have a look at whether our tax base, that is what we tax is the best way of describing it, is adequate to meet the needs of the future needs. And it highlighted an issue which has been increasingly under discussion about the rising cost of superannuation and the rising cost of healthcare, particularly for the elderly. We have an aging population, and as they age, and Gary, you're right on the front line, so you will see this, is they need more care. And so the demands are increasing on the health system. So Inland Revenue what it's done is it's sent out a draft of its insights into how it sees the tax system and what may be needed for consultation. Now, Sir Roger, together with Professor Ian McCulloch of the University of Auckland, Robert McCulloch, apologies Robert, produced this paper as a response to this proposal. They will send it back to Inland Revenue, and they've suggested something completely different. Whereas Inland Revenue have been looking at through one end of the spectrum, perhaps you would say, is well, are the taxes we've got going to meet the need we see happening? And they have looked at it and said, maybe we should be a bit more radical about this. And so they produced there's a short paper, it's only 8 pages, but it's actually something the two of them have been working on for quite some time, because I found a more detailed paper on it from 2019, which was published in 2020, just as COVID arrived. And they are suggesting something completely different. The bulk of the guts of the proposal is that the first $60,000 of income would no longer be taxed. But before you all jump up and down and say, whoopee, happy days, get out and spend, instead, that money would be directed into 3 types of saving accounts. One for health insurance, one for a type of health insurance, one for what they call a risk account, and one for long-term savings. And so they're saying, look, let us, rather than say we need to increase taxes to deal with these costs, why don't we flip the script and increase savings to meet these costs? So that's where they're coming from on that. And this, it's a radical proposal. It's what you would expect from Sir Roger, actually, because he is still determined to think through these solutions, try and provide practical solutions to what he sees as the major issues facing the New Zealand economy. What I think is interesting about this is they take a lot from Singapore. They look at the Singapore model, which is where they have this sort of savings and mandatory savings accounts in there, which fund their healthcare system and their savings account. And so that's where they've borrowed it from. And as I said, the key thing is there's in the paper, the bigger paper, there's other detail which I haven't talked about so much, but it would appear there would also be an increase in GST, and we can talk separately about regressive taxes because GST is regressive at the low end. But they would also take a significant cuts to what they see as welfare spending and by which they mean corporate welfare and people who really don't need it getting it. So they would be looking at, essentially, to some extent, means testing superannuation, raising the age of superannuation, looking to eliminate corporate benefits. One of the things they talk about there is tackling, but they don't go into any detail, is about reducing the benefit or subsidies, as they call it, that go to landlords. So it's a lot in this to consider. Um, what
Can we
I
take
was saying?
can we take a few of those
Oh
and just do
yes,
them piece by piece? Because I think
yeah.
each one of them is kind of a conversation
Oh,
on its
absolutely.
own. So I just find the concept interesting that the poor under the system, it sounds great. You know, they under 60,000, you'd get back about $10,000 a year. Um, of course, this is sort of a mandated or mandatory, a forced savings plan. And
Yes.
sometimes I think about the ethics of this, whereby the poor can be forced and compelled um, to do certain things that the rich would never entertain. So if you think about just your options decreasing when you get your food stamps, your options decreasing when you have to put this money into health insurance, a risk account, and long-term savings. Not necessarily saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying it automatically creates a difference in terms of freedom. These are working people who theoretically are working hard and trying to do the right thing in their life. And we are telling them they have to invest in vehicles um, when they may not necessarily have the faith that those vehicles will serve them well. I'm thinking specifically of health savings accounts in the United States, which were touted to be wonderful things. And mostly they were wonderful for the corporate um, the corporates that owned them, that marketed them, that profited from them, that charged very high management fees off of them, everyone taking their pound of flesh, and then often, wouldn't be there to provide extremely expensive care, wouldn't be there to provide primary care, which turned out to be more expensive than they had planned. They thought people would be able to get away with very minimalistic, catastrophic only insurance plans and they would be fine. And of course, they ended up struggling to get any care. And I mean, I think one of the benefits of having free, universal, open access primary care is that there's no bureaucracy to using it. We know when you put more hindrances in the way of patients, they're less likely to use it. So, uh, what comments would you have under this proposed system um, that address those issues?
I mean, they're all excellent points, and you're probably like, and I'll be honest, my sort of antennae twitched at this whole question of what appears to be a privatization of the health system and universal point of access, because we see all the horror stories that come out of the US, and we think, no, we don't want that. And we know
Okay,
about
you
postcode
don't
data.
want that, but our current government is launching us headlong towards that. I mean, they don't mince words. It's not like privatization by stealth. They very overtly say we intend to privatize as much as we can. All non-emergent surgeries is just the beginning. But sorry to interrupt. But carry on. You
Yeah,
and I
no, I
might.
mean, the full paper, which I found the full paper that they produced, because so as I said, what prompted me to comment on the podcast was that Sir Robert and Sir Roger and Professor Robert had put together a short paper of that, but they make reference to a longer paper which was prepared in 2019 and then published in the New Zealand Economic Journal in 2020. Now, that is actually very interesting reading, and it does pick up some salient points. It actually highlights some issues around that. And one of the points that I thought was interesting in that paper they pick up is an acknowledgement that there is wealth inequality in the country, and that this forced savings is a means, perhaps over the long term, of addressing those issues. Now, I found that interesting in there, and they make reference to the Norway Fund. And just a quick aside, so Roger is one of those love him or hate him figures in New Zealand tax. He was sorry, not in New Zealand tax, in New Zealand politics. He is the listener recently ran who are the most influential New Zealand finance ministers ever, or the top 10. The top three were in order: Sir Roger Douglas, unsurprising, Sir Michael Cullen, and then Sir Walter Nash, who was the Labour finance minister during the first Labour government. So in other words, the man who set up the welfare state and then funded New Zealand to run its World War II highly efficiently, by the way. Anyway, Sir Roger's background, some people may not be aware of this, but Sir Roger was involved with the setting up of what was the Kirk New Zealand Superannuation Fund, which was a gigantic, would have been a sovereign fund, compulsory savings in 1974. And it was established then. And the Muldoon and the national government, when they came in 1975, they came in on the promise that they would be, that was communism. It would be scrapped and everyone would be refunded, and everyone would get free super, funded super from age 60, funded by the state. Brian Gaynor, the respected business commentator who died a few years back, has always described that as the worst economic decision in post-World War II history, and it's hard to understate the damage that did. But what I feel ever since then, that part of what drives Sir Roger and still drives Sir Roger is trying to rectify that colossal mistake that he knew. He was involved in setting it up. He knew it was a long-term. It was bold. It would have worked. It would have made us. It would have been beneficial long-term. So he wanted to rectify that. And
now, is this anything? Does this anything to have anything to do with sort of Australia's version of a sovereign wealth fund?
Well, this would have been a sovereign wealth fund, Australia, but it doesn't. It predates Australia's go for compulsory superannuation, where they save 12% of their earnings, and the employers pay for that. But those are individual accounts, and so the sovereign wealth fund would have established that, something similar to what the Norwegians did with their gigantic oil fund that they set up with the North Sea oil revenues. Another classic example where individualism, as the Thatcher government did, meant that those huge revenues were wasted by the British instead of just tax cuts in the late 80s. Anyway.
And so we ended up getting all the worst aspects of Rogernomics without the sort of ameliorating aspects that could
That's
have
right. He has long tried to fix
national
this
wealth.
Yeah, he has tried to build a national wealth, and he tries to. He is in here, so that's to be fair to him on this. The problem I see with it is you've already highlighted one, that it's going to hit lower income people hardest, earliest. Now the bigger paper does try and address that by saying that there would be tax cuts. There would also be a reshaping of the wealth of the benefit system and the welfare system to be more targeted to really focus on low income and get rid of sort of an issue I've talked about frequently about the very high abatements. I mean, your listeners may not be aware fully about how abatement thresholds hit. Like, for example, if you earn more than $160, you're on job seeker and you earn more than $160 a week, every dollar above that 160 is clawed back at 70 cents on the dollar on top of the tax. So there are scenarios where people on very modest incomes can have what we call effective marginal tax rates of 70 to 80% and more. And this falls very heavily on the low income, single parent families. 30% of single parent families have an effective marginal tax rate of 50% or more. So what
Can you say that again? I think that deserves emphasis.
That 30%, this is a Treasury paper this year, said that revealed that 30% of all single parent families have an effective marginal tax rate of more than 50%. In other words, if they're earning income, more than 50% of it will go in tax and abatements. So,
and can we just juxtapose the ridiculousness of there being a 0% capital gains tax rate, of there not being? I mean, New Zealand seems incredibly unique among developed modern nations for its lack of many taxes. We don't have a land use tax. We don't have an inheritance tax. We obviously don't have a wealth tax. We also, unlike almost any place else other than some tax havens, don't have a capital gains tax. how did this remarkable situation occur where we're talking about effective marginal tax rates of 50% for the very poor? And at the same time, I can watch my house or my shares balloon and blossom in value and not pay taxes on that. How is that squared as being just?
It's not. It's a sort of, and this was a driving force behind the book that Deborah and I wrote was called Tax and Fairness, and we chose that title deliberately because we went boots in on this whole question of how our system has evolved without a capital gains tax or an inheritance tax. Some jurisdictions, not every jurisdiction like we compare ourselves to, has a capital gains tax. But you will find that almost all the jurisdictions we compare ourselves, the nations, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, there's 40 countries in it, so basically the 40 of the wealthiest countries in the world, they all have some form of wealth taxation, capital taxation. We don't. That's what makes us unique. Now, how that involved is a highly complicated story of basically well, it has to be described bluntly, as self-interest and highly effective lobbying by interest groups, farmers in particular. Um, um, and you hear this frequently. All taxes are distortionary. That's absolutely true. And I've worked in tax for 40 years now here and in the UK, and it is true. Taxes affect behaviour. The behavioural response to tax is quite interesting to observe. One of the things I always tell my clients, don't let the tax tail wag the investment dog. But people do. But what people don't acknowledge is, yes, if you tax something, you get behavioral shifts. But equally, if you don't tax something, you also get behavioral shifts. And so this is why we have a huge problem in our country around housing and overinvestment in property. And
I think Bernard Hickey describes it as a real estate market with an economy tacked on,
yeah,
or words to that effect.
Bernard and I have talked about this at length, but it's it. I'm not. Bernard's obviously one person, but there's not just me saying that. You know, time and again, the International Monetary Fund or the OECD will say to the government, "You need to think about a capital gains tax," and there will be pushback on about it, and you just have to honestly look at the conflicts of interest that exist in almost all our legislators. It's you have
Well,
to
you
be
only
cynical
need
on
to
it.
look as far as our prime minister, right? Christopher Luxon, they called him Mr. Seven Houses, getting his own form of abatement through Parliament for his property that he owned outright, also getting a sort of stipend on it. And then lucky enough to have a government, his government, it happens to be, change the bright line test, which he could immediately use to sell a few properties. I mean, yeah, it's clearly self-interested that the rich are in Parliament, they're asset rich, and they're going to make laws that protect assets more than people, seems to be the case.
Yes,
But
and I'm afraid we have to. No one wants to talk about class and politics, but sometimes we have to. I mean, politics. All tax is politics. What's taxed is a political decision. What's not taxed is a political decision. But we have been able to fence around this issue for too long as to why we don't have these taxes. And I was talking to the panel, the RNZ's the panel a couple of weeks back, and David Farrar, the blogger and pollster, started talking about how taxes are distortionary, and I just jumped in and made that point that you said, that I mentioned a few minutes ago, about how not taxing something is distortionary. And then it went on. Coming up next month, it will be the 40th anniversary of Australia introducing capital gains tax. So by David's argument, they introduced a capital gains tax. We didn't. We should be so much richer because we haven't got those distortions. But we all know that's not the case. Australia is a
right.
richer country. Many of these countries we compare ourselves have all the taxes we say are distortionary, and yet they're richer. So to me, increasingly, I see the problem that Bernard's identified is too much wealth is getting sunk into land, and that drives up prices. And then you get a vote of the older people holding land, boomers, and Generation X. I don't think they can think that the boomers are going to take all the blame on this one. Um, and they block developments. They vote. They're more regular to vote, particularly in local elections, and they block development. And so the price of housing, and then you've got an ideological aversion by the current government to building state houses. So the shortage of property, shortage of housing develops, and that is hindering all it hinders our economy greatly, because the end result is we bid up prices. I think the value of our residential property is 4 times our GDP. So that's $1.6
Wow.
trillion. And
Wow.
so to support that requires an enormous amount of debt. And this is where it really the rubber hits the road in terms of problems for the New Zealand economy. Most of that debt, those interest payments, are going offshore to Australian
To the
owned banks.
Australian banks.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that tightness, so government, I could talk all day about this, Gary, and you probably would want to cure for insomnia. It causes so many issues around this, but it means there's less funds available for proper economic development. We never developed a regional policy properly. And so Auckland has taken the strain in terms of population growth relative to to the rest of the country. And that has left us with scenarios. We're accelerating problems. Professor Paul Spoonley, who's from Massey University, he looks at demographics about how in the regional areas, and I think you're right, Tairāwhiti East Coast, is that right, Gary?
I'm in Northland in Whangarei.
Northland, yes, sorry, my apologies. But the example's still true, is that you will find in the regions, you're going to have a older, capital rich, aging population being serviced by a browner demographic, which is poorer. That's not a great recipe for social success, in my view. And we really have to grapple with it seems to me we really have to think about having an effective regional policy so we can fund hospitals, because with a country the size of Japan but a population smaller than Sydney, so that those are, and the way they sort of let the market sort everything out, which, or laissez-faire, which seems to be the ethos of the current government, just doesn't work. You actually need to think harder about how you are going to help and fund hospitals and regions and get them the services they need, because otherwise the center will collapse under the strain of too much being given to it to do with inadequate building happening infrastructure.
So
That's
I
long
think
rant,
the,
sorry.
the concept of free markets and laissez-faire is a useful theoretical construct, but in real life, they're not letting anything be free. They are, this government in particular, specifically giving billions, so 2.9 billion in tax deductibility to landlords. And I would argue you could have just if you wanted to help out the mom and pop landlord, you could have exempted them. One property, a batch, exempted. But they're allowing essentially, you know, vast commercial landlords to get better and cheaper mortgage rates, significantly better than a first-time homeowner. Like, how does that make any sense? How does that build a community or a society when you're locking people out of home ownership? Even ones with decent salaries have really no hope of paying off these mortgages that are up around the $1 million mark. It's quite incredible.
It is. I'll tell you a wee story about this. I was asked to talk at a was it Rotary Club about tax on this. I do some of these presentations at U3A, Rotary Clubs. Happy to just talk tax anytime. You just have to shut me up when you're bored. And I started by asking them, how many of them put their hand up if how many in the room had helped their children or grandchildren into a house? A sea of hands went up. And then I asked, keep your hand up if you were helped into a house. If you did, you could see a collective, oh, go around the room. They didn't realize that the generational shift had happened. So that when they started working, a single family, a single earner could support a family and buy a house. At a modest 3 to 4, you had support from the government. But now it takes 2 incomes, plus in some cases, if you want to be in a reasonable suburb in Auckland, support from your family to stay there. And that generational shift is absorbed. So there's so many statistics around it, but all of them are not good. But the concern that I have is that it used to be related to that is that people are going to people used to go, the middle classes go on their OE and they'd come back and they'll come back because New Zealand's a great place to raise kids and all that. But in my view, that's not happening anymore. They're going to Australia where the jobs.
Oh, what do we know that a person's leaving every 7 minutes, and a lot of them are young workers. The people that we desperately would want to retain are leaving.
The really concerning group in that demographic that's now emerged is the 35 to 45s are now going as well. And so we face a whole range of things, issues, which many of which all trace back to housing and overinvestment in how our tax treatment of housing. And so to bring it back to Sir Roger and Professor Robert, I don't agree with everything they're trying to do here on this, but I think they are looking at it through the right prism. We have to have a long-term solution. We have to maybe try something radical. I think they've underestimated, like so often, the people who espouse competition, underestimated difficulties of having competition in a remote market 2,000 kilometers away from the nearest physical neighbor, because they see competition in health services for keeping costs down. The commentary around what happens in Singapore is very interesting on this, but they see that the two working together, the government providing still large amounts of public health because of low income, because in there is able to act as an effective competitor to the private industry, private health insurers, so it keeps the costs down as they see it. I just don't see that happening here because we simply haven't got the scale around us. If someone can't get care in Singapore, they can hop across the ditch very quickly, literally, into Malaysia or into Thailand. And so they've got physical access quickly in the time it takes us to fly from Auckland to Wellington. You think about what's in that distance around Singapore, you've probably got several other countries around there. So there's big issues around that, their issue. It's a bold idea, but I think there are hurdles, and the transition is going to be difficult because they admit that there will be a drop in earnings. Because one of the things that happens is the companies get a corporate tax cut, but they also are required to pay top up. Roughly that by their calculations, about $20,000 a year is going into each savings account. Half of that comes from the tax cuts, they're saying, by exempting the first 60,000, but the balance comes from the companies basically paying some form of social insurance. And they see that as putting pressure on wages. And I see that as a huge problem because we're already a low wage economy.
Well, they acknowledge that it would actually increase poverty rates among the very poorest in society.
They're hoping that the welfare reforms they do sort that out, but you'd have to completely rethink how we go about welfare now. as I said, the interlocking abatements I talked about, the 30% of single parent families having an effective marginal tax rate of 50% or more, and then you get people on 60,000 working for families can be, and on job seeker, they're looking at 70% on every extra dollar they earn. So massive overhauls needed on that.
I mean, there's a couple things in there I like. I like this idea of reducing corporate welfare, right? So we've got corporate welfare just going out now, just announced 300 million to help a gas company drill for more gas. It was 219 million, but now it's 300 million for tobacco companies to help to help them sell more heated tobacco products. So the current government's clearly not averse to giving corporate welfare out. So, this proposal would be less of that. Wonderful. But I just feel like the very poor, whose numbers will increase slightly under Sir Roger Douglas's proposal, don't have good tax consultants like yourself on their side. They don't have tax lawyers. They don't have the politicians anymore, because those
That's the
guys
group
are
they're
getting,
missing. That is the group
yeah,
they're
they're
missing more than anything else. Never mind me. You'd be surprised at how little we can do in many cases. But it's yeah, it's
but I
very
mean,
hard not
when
to be cynical and think the best money you can do is get a lobbyist and lobby for get a former tobacco lobbyist as a minister for everything in government.
I
Talking
was
about
looking
you,
at
of
the last
course.
set of donations, campaign donations to the current coalition groups, and there are numbers of like $50,000, $200,000. I think there might have been one of 500,000, and you just have to ask yourself, if you, Terry, gave 500,000 to National or ACT, like, would you be doing that out of the kindness of your heart, or would you expect a little something in return, a little payback? And it's not lost on me that some of the biggest donors are actually landlord companies, or individuals that own landlord businesses, and clearly their investment has paid off. Can we talk about wealth inequality just for a second in New Zealand? I was looking in the stat that the bottom 50% of New Zealand, so roughly 2.5 million people, own 1% of the wealth in the country. So the bottom half of the nation holds 1% of its wealth. Can that possibly be true? Because it seems outlandish that the bottom 2.5 million people would control and own almost nothing in New Zealand. Does that number correlate with anything you've heard in the past?
I think it's more like 10%. It is horrendous, the numbers. Hang on, if you give me a second, I do happen to have a graph handy on this. I've prepared, as I said, I do a lot of presentations and talk, and so this sort of topic has come up for discussion. Um, uh, sorry, Gary, but yes, it is. There's an excellent graphic produced by Toby, not Manhire, for the spin-off. He used to do for the spin-off, and I'm really annoyed that I can't think of it straight away. Oh, hang on. Here we are.
I'm seeing a 5% owned by the bottom 50%.
Here we are.
And the top 1% owning 20% of the country's wealth.
That's right. I mean,
Right.
the
Remarkable.
aggregation of wealth in it's happened. The explosion of aggregation of wealth that's happened over the last 40 years is incredibly it's staggering and deeply troubling. Here we are. Can I share? Yes, here we are. The poorest 50%, it's 2%, according to this from this graphic here, and which the next 40%. So between 50% own 2%, then the next richest 40% own 39%. So basically match. But then the top
Proportionate.
10% own 59% of all wealth.
Wow. Yeah, it's a incredibly divided society.
And that's
And
the thing that's the trend that's happened since the in the last 40 years. That's why wealth taxes are back on the agenda and they're getting fierce pushback. There are technical issues as a tax consultant. I do see issues around wealth taxes, and I would not underestimate the risk of capital flight to Australia. The reason being that Australia, one of the reasons why that is obviously we've got easy move of wealth between a right to move and live and work in Australia. But one of the advantages of being a Kiwi working in Australia is you are not taxed on your overseas investment income if you are there under the ordinary residence category. If you don't become a permanent citizen, don't marry an Australian or live with an Australian citizen, then your non-Australian investment income and capital gains are not subject to tax in Australia. So if you are talking about serious capital wealth, capital flight, it is more of a risk than people shouldn't underestimate that. That's not to say that there may be a scope for some form of wealth tax. You've got to think about whether we'd want to have an estate tax reintroduced on that. There are issues around that because we have an extraordinary high number of trusts in the country, in this country. So that makes, and trusts are classic because they are deemed to hold assets separately. They basically render estate taxes ineffective without special measures. You're into all sorts of minute detail there, Gary, about that. So, but
No.
wealth inequality, Piketty hit a raw nerve when he published Capital in the 21st Century and his follow-up, Capital and Ideology. He was pushing on an open door. These issues are around, and I think that there are astute political observers will be wondering how the strain between great wealth, which we haven't seen since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, and increasing poverty and precariousness of income and housing are going to be reconciled. You add into the mix pressure. I don't want to sound like a doom scroller, but you add into the mix the pressures on population that are going to happen with climate change, where people will come away. And that's actually a huge pressure in the tax system, which the Inland Revenue Briefing and Sir Roger and Professor Roberts' paper did not acknowledge. I think it's climate change and the cost of relocating people is the first big cost that's going to hit everybody now, because that's actually tangible. My batch has been washed away, or I can't insure my batch. I can't insure my home, which is in the floodplain in South Dunedin. Therefore, I can't get a mortgage. What are you going to
do? Or in my neck of the woods, 2 successive years of catastrophic drought would have a generational impact on farmers. I mean, they can withstand 1 year, but when you're talking about multiple drought years and then inundations and loss of topsoil, you're really talking about, like you said, some doomsday scenarios that we seem to, as a government, not be preparing for, which seems remarkable to me.
I think I've been thinking about in terms of political cycles in 40 years. That when I started voting, 1979 was a crux year for the post-war settlement, because that's the Iranian Revolution, Margaret Thatcher's election, and Paul Volcker becoming chairman of the Federal Reserve. And so the change that all those 3 events sparked, they set in motion a sort of a break within the post-war settlement. This is all big theory, Gary. Sorry.
Well, that was the
I'm not sure.
beginning of the end for the welfare state. I mean, Thatcher,
That's
Reagan, Rogernomics, they really put the screws
they all
on.
flow on very quickly. But
Yeah.
so what I'm going to say to you, 1984 and the election of the 4th Labour government and Rogernomics is 41 years ago. And so what I would say to you is, what is 41 years relative to 1984? And you're talking about 1944 and the Bretton Woods Agreement, the establishment of the post-war order. So what I'm saying is, by 1984, it was recognized that the system set up in 1944 was no longer functioning as well as it hoped, because you had stagflation and all the rest of it. So why are we saying now, 40 years on, that what was happened and brought in following in 1984 to 1993 and around the world all of that time is still the best way forward. That's the trap the current government, to me, are stuck in. They're looking at it through this paradigm that's the one plan, and it's no longer effective. We have, as you noted, 7 people leaving every minute. No, or 1 person leaving every 7 minutes going to Australia. And we have an economy that's stalled because it's going nowhere, because the old tax cuts and interest rate cuts will boost the economy and away we go again, isn't working. So, and the social pressures are still there all the time. So as I see it, I think we are going to be changing our paradigm, but we're in that interregnum. We don't know what's going to force the brakes, so to speak, on that.
In New Zealand, I see the last great piggy bank for raiding. Once you've sort of bankrupted individuals, they can no longer afford homes. They're not going to be in their own house with any reasonable assurance. Once you've raided personal wealth, what is left? I mean, you've gone for the middle class. You've degraded them. You've still got public services that you can raid, which I think we're seeing now. That's my own field. I'm an emergency doctor. And we're watching the breakdown and essentially the stripping out for parts of the public health sector to funnel money into private. And so we're seeing this amazing boom in private radiology groups, right? X-rays, CTs, private surgeries and surgical centers, telehealth, private urgent care, getting literally hundreds of millions of dollars that previous would have gone into the public sector, now being redistributed. So, and we're going to then get the sell-off of public assets and maybe some of these public-private partnerships where essentially there'll be, again, the ransacking of the public sector. So that's what I see happening. You've impoverished people, you've now impoverished governmental wealth, and then what's left? Just sort of American style dog eat dog, you either have money or don't type of scenario. And that's really what I'm trying to push back against. Do you have any advice for people who do want a better and more egalitarian and fairer and more just economic system? Like, what do you see as the levers that have been used? You have a good breadth of history. What do you see that regular people can be doing to push us away from a ransacking of civil society and its assets?
Vote and everything. Vote at all times. Vote locally, particularly locally, because all politics is local. And I think that was a US speaker who said that, but it's true. But be involved, get involved, vote. Look at what's happening in your school. Go ask to be on the school board there, because they're not everyone is applying for that. Just try and be involved. Even if you just do nothing more than vote, that's the first and most important thing that you do. And encourage your children to vote, and on that, and engage with politicians. Write to them and say, I'm not happy with this. Let them know that you're not happy about this, and you work out who responds, who won't respond. You may say, even if you're in the deep blue seat, or something you don't feel that something it is. That little step of just being involved and engaged is important. It's the most important thing you can do, in my view. And try but also at the local level. So you see, just watch to see who is being backing. So is that particular councillor being backed by a property developer? Local councils are really interesting in that. I got involved in local councils in Auckland when, after the election of Wayne Brown, because he said, I'm going to sell off the airport shares, which I thought selling a strategic monopoly asset makes no sense, except when you consider how the funding model is set up for councils. It made more sense than it, because it wasn't bringing in any income, but they couldn't leverage its growth and value to borrow against. So it actually made sense. But the thing to recognize about what happens in councils is there are a lot of councillors who get elected who say, vote for me and I will keep the services the same, but rates won't rise. And they are able to get in because councils, unlike government, central government, are not party driven. So a mayor you vote directly for the mayor, and then the mayor has to assemble a coalition of like-minded people to get anything done. So it means that people can sit on the fringes and be naysayers for re-elected time and time again, because they're able to say to their constituency, I didn't vote for these rate rises. And they leave it to progressives to work, and the mayors who take the blunt of this, to work together to get stuff done. What's happened down in Wellington with Tory Fanau is a good example of that, where she assembled a coalition of people to help her get money put into infrastructure, but was opposed by a whole group of naysayers doing the chanting, oh, we just need to cut services and more efficient. We've been doing that for ages, but there comes a point where you just have to spend money. So it's hard. I mean, it doesn't sound terribly exciting, but it's a simple thing to do, to vote, see who's backing who, and look to see who's actually making steps to try and improve your community and support them. Even if it's just voting, put up a hoarding or something like that. It's simple. Every journey begins with a single step. I'm probably counting Mao there. Jesus, my parents would disown me if they knew how communist I was.
No, that's fantastic advice.
Yes.
I would also point out that I think his name is Hayden Donnell. He recently wrote
he's great. He's great
a
fun.
spin-off
Hayden.
article, and looking specifically at council spending on infrastructure, and showing that despite all the frothing on the internet and all of the social media keyboard warriors talking about rates rises, the reality of the situation is for about 100 years, there had been almost nil growth in infrastructure spending relative to GDP in New Zealand. And so we've got this incredibly derelict amount of water pipes and sewage pipes that have been calling out for repair for literally decades, the better part of a half century in many cases. And there has not been any desire to actually do what's needed and maintain and upkeep the infrastructure. And now it's at the end of its usable life, and people are left saying, well, what do we do now? And I guess that's the danger of these short-term governments. They only have to worry about, like this government, for example, really only has to worry about the next election. But 30 years from now, the things that set into play, it will not be around to be held accountable for. It's a fascinating idea, the challenges of our civil society. We could talk all day, but I also realize that people probably don't want to listen to an hour and a half long podcast, but maybe they do. But I would like to have you back on in the future. I'm sure there will be another timely tax controversy that we can discuss in a couple of months. So thank you for chatting with me. It was really a pleasure. It's fascinating, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much, Gary. It's a pleasure to be on, and kia pātora. Welcome. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. And it's been an honor to be talking with you, Gary, and I look forward to the next time. Cheers.
You too, Terry.